The forest outside Aachen had been quiet for 11 minutes. Corporal Heinrich Brandt knew this because he had been counting. Not from discipline, but because silence on the Western Front in October 1944 was not peace. It was geometry. It meant someone was calculating angles. He pressed his back against the shattered wall of a farmhouse and watched the tree line, and then from somewhere inside those trees came a sound he had never heard before. Dot. Not a crack, not a bang, but something between the two, something lower, with a mechanical clatter underneath it that his brain could not immediately categorize. The man beside him was gone before the echo finished. Brandt did not hear a second shot. He simply noticed the silence where a person used to be. There is a particular cruelty embedded in the rifle, more personal than artillery, more intimate than the bomber overhead. It selects. It reaches across a specific distance and finds a specific person and makes a specific decision. Every soldier who has ever moved through contested ground understands this instinctively, which is why the sound of an unfamiliar weapon is among the most psychologically destabilizing experiences combat produces. Your brain has cataloged the known threats, assigned them distances and directions and probabilities. An unknown sound destroys that catalog entirely. Suddenly you don't know where the danger is, how fast it travels, how many rounds it carries, or whether the cover you are crouching behind means anything at all. In World War II, the rifle evolved faster than in any previous conflict in human history. In 6 years, it transformed from a bolt-action instrument, largely unchanged since the First World War, into semi-automatic and fully automatic systems that rewrote the mathematics of infantry combat entirely. Most people know the M1 Garand. Most know the German K98. But the rifles that changed the war, the ones that soldiers feared with a specific, personal, intimate dread, are the ones history placed quietly on a back shelf. This is their story. In the summer of 1943, Soviet infantry officers along the Eastern Front began filing reports that described a German weapon behaving in ways that contradicted everything they understood about infantry tactics. German soldiers who previously would have needed to advance, consolidate, and reload were now maintaining continuous fire while moving. Positions that should have required 10 men to hold were being held by 4. The volume of fire coming from single German positions was not consistent with any bolt action or even semi-automatic weapon the Soviets had in their intelligence files. They were encountering the Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first mass-produced assault rifle, and they had no doctrinal framework to understand it. The STG-44 was the creation of German firearms designer Hugo Schmeisser, developed under a weapons program that Adolf Hitler himself initially opposed. Hitler preferred traditional rifle thinking. He wanted long-range precision weapons, believing that the psychological dominance of a soldier who could kill at distance was more valuable than high-volume, close-range fire. He was, in this judgment, fundamentally wrong, and the men dying along the Eastern Front paid the price for that error, until the program was finally approved and accelerated in 1943, partly through the politically clever rebranding of the weapon as a Maschinenkarabiner, a machine carbine, rather than a rifle, to avoid Hitler's objection. What the STG-44 gave German infantry was a capability that simply did not exist before it. The weapon fired an intermediate cartridge, smaller than a full rifle round, larger than a pistol round, at a cyclic rate of 500 rounds per minute, selectable between semi-automatic and full automatic fire, in a package that a single soldier could carry and control. Its effective range of 300 meters covered the vast majority of actual combat engagements, where the long-range precision of a bolt-action rifle was statistically irrelevant compared to the ability to put multiple rounds on a target in less than a second. Soviet soldiers who encountered STG-44 fire in the close-quarters fighting of urban terrain described a qualitative difference in how the weapon felt to be under. Bolt-action fire had a rhythm, crack, pause, that experienced soldiers learned to move within. The STG-44 had no rhythm. It was continuous. It filled space rather than punctuating it, which meant that the instinctive infantry skill of using an enemy's reload cycle to advance or reposition became suddenly useless. The weapon didn't give you that gap. It didn't give you anything. Over 425,000 STG-44s were produced before the war's end. They were not produced in sufficient numbers to reverse Germany's strategic collapse, but they were produced in sufficient numbers to mark a threshold. Every assault rifle manufactured in the world today, The AK-47, the M16, the weapons carried by soldiers in every army on Earth, descends conceptually from the STG-44. Hugo Schmeisser himself was taken to the Soviet Union after Germany's defeat, where Soviet engineers studied his work intensively. The precise degree of his contribution to Mikhail Kalashnikov's subsequent design remains contested. The lineage does not. The night was not supposed to be this quiet. British Special Operations Executive Operative Sergeant Thomas Allen, operating in occupied France in the winter of 1944, age 28, a former gamekeeper from Derbyshire, whose entire professional life had been built around the skill of moving through landscape without disturbing it, had a specific problem. There was a German sentry, there was a gate, and there were 40 meters between his current position and the objective beyond that gate. 40 meters that the sentry covered with a predictable and measured pace. He had one option, and it made almost no sound at all. The Delisle Commando carbine was, by most acoustic measurements, the quietest firearm ever used in combat during World War II. Developed by British engineer William Delisle in 1942, it combined a bolt-action mechanism derived from the Lee Enfield rifle with a barrel chambered for the .45 ACP pistol cartridge and an integrated suppressor of such effectiveness that the loudest sound the weapon produced was the mechanical click of the bolt cycling. The subsonic pistol cartridge, traveling below the speed of sound, produced no supersonic crack. The suppressor absorbed the gas expansion report almost entirely. At 20 meters, the Delisle was quieter than a handclap. Fewer than 130 were ever produced. They were issued almost exclusively to British commandos, special operations executive agents, and special air service operators working behind enemy lines, where the ability to neutralize a single sentry without alerting a garrison was the difference between mission success and the death of everyone involved. The rifle was specifically designed for a category of warfare that conventional military thinking barely acknowledged. Not the destruction of armies, but the removal of individuals, in darkness, in silence, in territory where the sound of a single shot would cascade into catastrophe. What makes the Delisle significant in this story is the nature of the fear it generated. Not the mass, overwhelming fear of a weapon that fills the sky with fire, but something quieter, and in some ways, worse. German garrison commanders in occupied France became aware, through the accumulating evidence of sentries found dead, with no report heard and no alarm raised, that something was operating in their area that they could not hear coming. The psychological effect on garrison troops of knowing that death could arrive silently and selectively, that the darkness outside the wire was not merely dangerous, but actively chosen, produced a specific kind of dread that loud weapons simply cannot generate. Loud weapons tell you where to look. Silent ones tell you that looking doesn't help. Finland, 1940. The Winter War had already demonstrated something that the rest of the world's military establishments had not yet absorbed, that the Soviet Red Army, despite its numerical mass, could be bled badly by a smaller, better-positioned force using superior individual weapons handling. Finnish soldiers, armed with bolt-action Mosin Nagants, had inflicted catastrophic casualties on Soviet troops advancing through forested terrain. The lesson the Red Army took from this was precise and urgent. Individual Soviet infantrymen needed a faster rifle. The SVT-40, designed by Fedor Tokarev and adopted in 1940, was the Soviet answer. A gas-operated semi-automatic rifle, firing the full-power 7.62 by 54 mm R cartridge, the same round used in Soviet machine guns. It gave a single Red Army soldier the ability to deliver accurate, rapid follow-up fire that bolt-action German infantry simply could not match in certain engagement scenarios. In the hands of experienced soldiers, the SVT-40 could deliver accurate semi-automatic fire at a rate that stunned German infantry accustomed to counting the gap between Soviet shots. The weapon had significant flaws. It was mechanically sensitive, prone to malfunction when inadequately maintained, and required a level of individual weapon care that was difficult to sustain in the mud and cold of the Eastern Front. Soviet military doctrine eventually moved away from it in favor of simpler weapons, better suited to mass armies. But in the hands of the soldiers who mastered it, particularly Soviet naval infantry and elite guards units, the SVT-40 was something German infantry specifically feared and specifically attempted to acquire. Captured SVT-40s were issued to German troops under the designation Selbstladegewehr 258R, a formal acknowledgement by the Wehrmacht that the enemy's rifle was worth carrying. The Finnish army, having captured significant quantities during the Winter War, used SVT-40s throughout the subsequent continuation war with particular effectiveness. Finnish soldiers, already expert marksmen, found in the SVT-40 a semi-automatic capability that amplified skills they already possessed to a degree that made them extraordinarily dangerous at the individual combat level. German soldiers fighting alongside Finnish units noted the combination with a specific admiration. A marksman's precision, applied at semi-automatic speed, was, in their assessment, among the most lethal individual capabilities on the Eastern Front. The rifles in this story do not appear in most museum exhibitions. They are not the weapons that generals reference when they recount campaigns, not the ones that appear in the first paragraph of history books about the war's turning points. They are the weapons of individual soldiers, of the 40 meters between a man and a gate, of the tree line that produces an unfamiliar sound, of the 11 minutes of silence that a corporal counts, because silence is its own kind of language. But perhaps that is exactly why they matter as much as they do. The history of war is often written at the scale of armies, of divisions and offensives and supply lines and strategic miscalculations made in rooms far from the fighting. The rifle exists at a different scale entirely. It exists at the scale of one person, one decision, one moment of contact between a human being and the physical fact of what war asks. The STG-44 changed that scale permanently, redrawing the mathematics of how many people one person could affect in 1 second. The Deadliest changed the acoustics of that scale, removing the sound that had always announced the decision being made. The SVT-40 changed the tempo, eliminating the pause that soldiers had learned to live inside. Each of these weapons, in its own way, closed a gap. The gap between shots, the gap between sound and consequence, the gap between what a single soldier could do and what an entire squad had previously required. And in closing those gaps, they changed not just tactics, but the psychological experience of being a soldier, the texture of fear, the geometry of survival, the calculus of which cover matters, and which is only the illusion of safety. Corporal Heinrich Brandt survived Aachen. He was captured in December 1944 and spent the final months of the war in an American prisoner of war camp in Belgium. In his post-war account, he described the 11 minutes of silence in that ruined farmhouse, not as waiting, but as understanding. The slow, cold recognition that the rules he had learned about where danger came from and what it sounded like no longer applied. That the weapon he could not identify was not simply a better rifle. It was evidence that the war had moved past the point where his experience was a reliable guide to his survival. That feeling, the obsolescence of everything you knew, may be the most honest description of what modern warfare does to the men who fight it. Not simply that it kills, but that it keeps changing the terms, keeps producing new sounds, new silences, new distances at which death becomes possible. And the soldier, always, arrives with the knowledge of the last war and must survive the next one.